President Cyril Ramaphosa is yet to appoint an envoy to Washington to explain South Africa's position with Russia. Now, the spokesperson for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation could not confirm who will lead the envoy. The International Criminal Court on the 18th of March this year issued an arrest warrant for Russia's President Vladimir Putin for alleged war crimes. Now, Russian President Putin is planning a visit to South Africa in August. But for more analysis on this matter, we joined virtually by senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo de Carvalho. Gustavo, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much for having me.
So it's evident that South Africa is hoping to avoid a diplomatic fallout, and this could also potentially put at risk, just at the broad outset, investment or relations worth 400 billion. So let's talk about this fallout that South Africa is trying to avoid.
Thank you very much. And from the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2022, we've seen South Africa being put in a really difficult position globally. On the one hand, South Africa is facing to be a non-aligned country or maintaining its own strategic autonomy within that, but it also has shown a lot of cozy relations with Russia in the last year, really creating a strain in its own bilateral relations with the United States. So this visit to the United States, for me, it's quite an important step for South Africa to maintain its autonomy on the one hand, but also keeping one of its largest bilateral trading partners, that is the United States. So that's certainly an opportunity for the country to ensure that it's indeed non-aligned, that it's indeed maintaining a degree of strategic autonomy, and at the same time keeping its relationships with the United States that are quite important for the country, both in terms of trade and also in terms of a lot of political engagements within the continent, where the two countries have a lot of similar positions too.
So, Gustavo, South Africa has maintained a neutral, non-aligned stance and has refused to cut ties with Russia. Now, is it fair, some would ask, for the United States to impose who South Africa should be friendly or have relations with?
That is certainly one of the big discussions right now. And I think when we look into countries from the global south or developing countries in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, all of these countries have faced difficulties around that. And that's certainly in the United States having quite a hawkish position when it comes to its own approaches towards other global powers in the world. It does put South Africa in a difficult position, but it also showcases that South Africa needs to have clear lines of communication, clear positions, and to some extent to take charge of its own narratives. I think right now what we have seen is a country that is very reactive to specific situations on the ground, and South Africa does need to become more proactive. So this visit to the US becomes an important point where we have seen a number of recent visits from South African officials to Russia, and also allowing itself to engage more closely with one important trading partner, that is the United States.
So the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for the Russian President Vladimir Putin, but the Deputy Minister in the Presidency, ANC's International Relations Subcommittee Deputy Chairperson, Mr. Obed Bapela, he told a weekend publication that no sitting president would be arrested in this country. So this, of course, again, very interesting given what had happened with the Umar al-Bashir situation some years back. But what does this mean for South Africa in this moment, given that we are still a few months away from that BRICS engagement?
This is a really important development for how South Africa sees its own foreign policy, but also how South Africa sees its commitments to treaties that it has signed, and in this case, the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. We saw after the saga and the drama that was around al-Bashir's non-arrest in 2015, and particularly the ruling of the Supreme Court of accusing South Africa that has indicated that South Africa would have to arrest and to basically follow arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court. In that sense, for me, it seems that more than there is a legal requirement in South Africa, and there is a legal discussion that we need to have, but it also would really have to reflect on how South Africa relates to its own commitments internationally. South Africa remains as a member of the International Criminal Court, and in that sense, that legal discussion is very important. But it also showed to me that in the case of Vladimir Putin coming to South Africa, what are relationships between South Africa and Russia, and how does Russia see the relationship with South Africa? By putting South Africa in that position, knowing that South Africa would have to arrest Vladimir Putin, it does create a number of questions about that friendship in itself. Because the big loser in that all of that is not Russia. It would be very unlikely for Vladimir Putin coming to South Africa knowing that he would have the chance of being arrested. But if that is the case, then what is that friendship about? I think that really shows a lot about in terms of what South Africa would require to do. But it also shows that the importance of the country to really proactively providing its positions, what its commitments are, and to showcase for all of us within the country what is expected of the country internationally, so that we can then make an assessment about that. So I think what we have seen in recent weeks is a fairly shy approach from the country, and I understand it does require a lot of thinking of how to react, but the country does need to provide clear positions where it stands around that and what is going to happen with the BRICS summit in August.
So it seems as though South Africa is very clear. What are your thoughts on the likelihood of Vladimir Putin, should he decide to attend that BRICS summit here in South Africa, that he would be arrested?
My feeling at this stage is that there is a legal discussion within South Africa, but there is also a political engagement that South Africa will be pursuing in the coming months. And I think that it's probably the most important now. I think to some degree, reflecting on what would happen to the BRICS summits in the coming years, noting that Brazil, another member of the BRICS, is the president of BRICS next year. And Brazil is also a signatory of the Rome Statute and would have to follow similar requirements. So would that mean a change of the nature of the BRICS summit, finding a third country to do that? And if so, what will the different BRICS members, and particularly those two of the BRICS members that are signatories of the International Criminal Court Treaty, what would mean for them? And I think that it's an important discussion to have in terms of where are we standing in terms of our own stated position of being non-aligned, of maintaining strategic autonomy, but at the same time noting that treaties like the ones that created the International Criminal Court are considered within international law to be domestic. They are part of the domestic law because they have been domesticated, they have been internalized within our own context. And in that sense, that is a really important process, and how South Africa will do that publicly or behind closed doors will certainly define not only the future of some of the next couple of years in terms of BRICS summits, but also in terms of what is South Africa's position when it comes to its own treaties that it has signed and ratified.
So speaking of those treaties, as a signatory to the Rome Statutes, and given what has happened previously and the dilemma that South Africa finds itself in right now with the BRICS summit and Putin's possible attendance, how do you think we should navigate this space as a nation? Should we be reviewing our status in terms of being a signatory to the statutes, or and what would it mean if we were to, for example, withdraw from that?
I think we've seen in the wake of al-Bashir's saga that the departing from the International Criminal Court, it is something that would create an enormous backlash for the country and its pursuit in terms of international justice. There's certainly a challenge in terms of some of the rulings of the International Criminal Court, and I think there is the need to revisit some of those. And I think South Africa, together with other developing countries that have often seen to be in as targets of the International Criminal Court, there is an important process of reflecting on its effectiveness of its tools, the ability of responding to a more equitable way in terms of war crimes. But in that sense, also ensuring that South Africa, by doing that, does not showcases that it's against issues related to accountability for international crimes. And that remains very important. I think there remains an important axis of South African foreign policy, and the country should be able to become a leader when it comes to that reflection about what type of international criminal courts do we want that is reflective to the needs, to the responses, and that becomes more equitable as a tool. And I think just leaving and withdrawing from the International Criminal Court is not enough for that. I think it provides completely different messages when it comes to the country's commitments to international law, to international humanitarian law, and to those that are suffering the most from conflicts that are usually civilians.
So, Gustavo, the question then is, who should be appointed as the envoy to Washington, someone who will successfully articulate South Africa's position?
I think speculating on names now would be quite hard, but certainly we could be talking about what type of individual or individuals that would be seen in that delegation. I think we certainly need someone that can create open lines of communication, and I think that is particularly important. We've seen last week with the visit from President Macron to China that these ideas of strategic autonomy is increasingly not something that is just a claim from countries from the global south. And I think there is a timing that developing countries like South Africa should be using that, not to distance itself from the United States, but rather to create points that pragmatically benefit South Africa and at the same time create that degree of trust between the countries. That is not to say that by South Africa going to the United States, it should simply respond to its positions to Russia. I think it should be much more broader than that, and to showcase that South Africa and the US as bilateral partners have much to achieve together, but it does not necessarily mean that it's going to have the same position in every single issue globally. And I think when it comes to the crisis in Europe and the crisis in Ukraine in particular, I think Macron, and the reason why I'm using that is that Macron specifically talks about the need of distancing itself from conflicts that are not ours. And that's quite clear when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. But by doing that, it should not simply say that we are friends and with Russia as a blanket statement. I think there is definitely an opportunity for South Africa to showcase its own ability of navigating very carefully within global political context. We are very divided and very difficult for South Africa to present itself, but at the same time showing that there are within a space where we have differences, and we clearly have differences in certain issues with the United States. There is still several points within that agenda that makes us closer. Where it is in relation to economic development, where it is in relation to climate change, what is in relation to a number of issues that often South Africa and the US are close to one another. And I think that is particularly important for the country when it comes to creating narratives and taking care of those narratives in terms of that showcases there is a national interest at stake. But I think that those national interests need to be much better clarified in terms of its relations with bilateral partners, including the US. Not only the US, but including the US.
Well, we'll have to leave it there for today as we wait to see who is appointed and how that message is articulated. Gustavo de Carvalho is senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs, speaking about attempts to resolve a diplomatic fallout, a possible fallout between South Africa and the United States over Russian ties.